The briefing room at Camp Victory was not a small room. It had been built to hold a general officer's staff, and on the morning in question, it was holding one, along with 14 members of his planning cell, 2 liaison officers from the Intelligence Directorate, and a British exchange officer whose presence at the table was, depending on which American account you read, either routine or the reason the general had requested the meeting in the first place. The room had a projection screen, a classified network terminal, and a map of Baghdad that covered most of one wall. The general had been in the room for 40 minutes before he said the thing that nobody wrote down. He said they had more men. He said they had more money. He said they had more equipment. And then he said the thing that the room had been waiting for him to say. The thing that had been sitting in the operational statistics for the past 14 months without any senior officer putting it in those terms, without any formal document framing it, the way the data was clearly demanding it be framed. He said they still beat us. Nobody filed an after-action report on that meeting. The after-action report that should have followed the period of operations it was assessing was drafted, reviewed, and then classified at a level that placed it beyond the reach of the congressional oversight mechanisms that would normally have captured its conclusions. It was not destroyed. Destroying classified documents of that kind required a process that would itself have left a paper trail. It was filed in a system that the people who needed to read it were not cleared to access. And the general who had said the words that should have been its opening paragraph was rotated out of theater 8 weeks later and has not, in any public forum, repeated them. This is the story of what was in the report that was never filed. It begins not with a defeat, because it was not a defeat in any conventional military sense. It begins with a ratio so stark, so resistant to any explanation that preserved the institutional narrative the American military had been constructing about the Iraq War since 2003, that the general who understood it fully could not put it in writing without producing a document that would have embarrassed his command, complicated the political situation in Washington, and forced a public conversation that neither the Pentagon nor the British Ministry of Defense was prepared to have. The ratio was this. At the peak of combined special operations activity in Baghdad during 2006 and 2007, the British SAS element operating under the Task Force Black designation was responsible for approximately 1/3 of all high-value target captures in the city. The SAS element at any given time numbered fewer than 60 operational personnel. The American Special Operations Forces operating in the same theater, under the Joint Special Operations Command structure that General Stanley McChrystal had built into the most powerful counterterrorism apparatus in the history of warfare, numbered in the hundreds, supported by a budget that ran into billions of dollars annually, with organic aviation assets, dedicated intelligence squadrons, and a technological support architecture that the British element could not have matched with its entire annual operating budget. 1/3 of the high-value captures, less than 5% of the Special Operations Force. That ratio is the document that was never filed. To understand what the ratio meant to the American commanders who were watching it accumulate in the operational statistics, you need to understand what they had built. McChrystal's JSOC in Iraq by 2006 was not simply a collection of elite military units. It was an industrial system for the identification, location, and neutralization of high-value targets, and it had been built with the explicit understanding that industrial problems required industrial solutions. The insurgency in Iraq was not a fixed enemy force that could be defeated in a single engagement. It was a network, or more precisely, it was a collection of overlapping networks, and networks regenerated. Kill a cell commander, and his network would produce another. Capture a bomb maker, and another would be trained. The only way to defeat a network was to move faster than it could regenerate, to maintain a tempo of targeting that outpaced the enemy's ability to replace what was being removed. McChrystal had understood this earlier than almost anyone else in the coalition, and he had built his machine accordingly. The intelligence architecture that JSOC operated in Iraq by 2006 was genuinely unprecedented. A fusion center at Balad employing more than 300 analysts, linguists, and signals intelligence specialists working around. The clock across a facility the size of a commercial aircraft hangar. Dedicated ISR platforms orbiting over Baghdad in continuous rotation, feeding real-time imagery to analysts who could direct tasking within minutes of identifying a person of interest. NSA collection assets targeting the communications architecture of every significant insurgent network in the city, with the processing capability to turn raw intercepts into actionable intelligence within hours. A targeting cycle that McChrystal had compressed from days to hours, then from hours towards something approaching real time through the relentless application of technology, personnel, and institutional will. The output of this system was impressive by any measure. JSOC was conducting between 10 and 15 raids per night across Iraq at the peak of its operational tempo. High-value targets were being captured or killed at a rate that was genuinely degrading the insurgent network's capacity to plan and execute complex attacks. The find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze cycle that McChrystal had institutionalized was working. The machine was producing results. And the British, with 60 operators and a compound that American visitors described as comically austere, were producing a third of the Baghdad high-value captures while conducting fewer than 10% of the raids. The general who said they still beat us was not a man given to imprecision. He had spent 30 years in the American military, developing the habit of saying exactly what the data supported and nothing more. What the data supported, by the time he sat in that briefing room and said what he said, was the conclusion that the SAS was achieving an output-to-resource ratio that the entire apparatus of American special operations could not match, and that the reason it could not match it was not a matter of technology or budget or personnel numbers. It was a matter of something the American system had not been designed to measure and could not easily reproduce. The British intelligence methodology was the beginning of the explanation. The human intelligence networks that the SAS elements attached intelligence officers had been developing since before the invasion were producing targeting intelligence of a specificity and timeliness that the American technical collection architecture could not consistently generate against the same target sets. The distinction was not between good intelligence and bad intelligence. Both the American and British systems were producing good intelligence. The distinction was between intelligence that described a network and intelligence that described a person. The American system, with its enormous technical collection capability, was extraordinarily good at the former. Signals intelligence, pattern of life analysis, network mapping from captured materials. These methods produced a comprehensive picture of how insurgent organizations were structured, how they communicated, where their resources were held, and how their various elements related to each other. What those methods produced with less consistency was the specific, timely, actionable information about where a specific individual would be on a specific night. The human intelligence networks the British were running were producing exactly that information, all because they had been built over years through a methodology that prioritized depth of access over breadth of coverage, that accepted a slower initial collection tempo in exchange for a qualitatively different kind of intelligence product at the end of it. A captured AQI document, recovered during a task force black operation in the Dora district in mid-2006, illustrated the distinction with involuntary clarity. The document was an internal communication from a mid-level AQI logistics coordinator to his superior, discussing what the author described as the night visitors, the SAS raids, that had been systematically dismantling the Dora network over the preceding weeks. The coordinator had attempted to analyze how the British were finding their targets, and his analysis revealed the exact shape of his own intelligence blind spot. He attributed the raids to technical surveillance. He described in detail the countermeasures the network had implemented against what he believed was electronic monitoring. Change phones after every call, use couriers for sensitive coordination, vary routes and timing. The measures were sensible and would have been effective against the technical collection methods he had identified as the source of his problems. None of them addressed the actual source. The human intelligence that was finding his network operated through sources he had not identified as compromised, using methods his counterintelligence procedures were not designed to detect. While his network was changing phones and varying routes, the sources that the British intelligence officers had developed over months of patient, careful work were reporting on the new phones and the new routes as soon as they were established. The countermeasures were providing the intelligence that updated the targeting. The AQI logistics coordinator was not wrong to be afraid of surveillance. He was wrong about what kind. The document was assessed in the combined intelligence space where British and American analysts had been working alongside each other throughout the campaign. The American analysts who read it understood immediately what it revealed. One of them, whose account has been partially preserved through journalistic sources, described the moment of reading it as the clearest evidence he had encountered in 2 years of Iraq intelligence work of what the difference between technical and human collection actually meant in operational terms. The enemy knew he was being watched. He had correctly identified that the watching was sophisticated. He had completely failed to understand what kind of sophistication was killing his network. That failure was the gap the British had been operating in. The close target reconnaissance methodology that the SAS had been applying before every significant direct action raid was the second element of the explanation the general's unwritten report would have needed to provide. The American approach to pre-raid intelligence preparation relied heavily on technical surveillance, drone feeds, signals collection, pattern of life, analysis from overhead imagery. These methods were effective at building a picture of activity at a target location over time. They were less effective at providing the specific, a real-time confirmation of a target's presence that was the difference between a raid that produced a high-value capture and a raid that produced an empty building. The SAS method was to put people close to the target before the assault element moved. Not drones, not electronic sensors, people. 2 operators in a static observation post, sometimes in position for 24 or 48 hours before the assault, watching the target location with their eyes and recording what they saw in notebooks with pencils. No electronic emissions, no battery-dependent systems, no software that could glitch or a signal that could be detected by an adversary with a commercial radio scanner. Just 2 men who had been trained to remain motionless, awake, and observant for periods that most human beings would find physiologically impossible, confirming with their own eyes that the target was present before the assault element was committed. The compromise rate, the percentage of operations where the target had been warned before the assault force arrived, was the metric that made the difference between the 2 approaches visible in operational terms. The American vehicle-borne operations in Baghdad's urban districts had a compromise rate that JSOC's own analysis had established at between 30 and 45%. Roughly 4 operations in 10 were compromised before the first boot hit the ground. The armored vehicles were audible from blocks away. The helicopter overwatch created a distinctive pattern in the sky that anyone who had been watching coalition operations for more than a month knew how to read. The electronic countermeasures suites that the vehicles carried to defeat radio-controlled IEDs also broadcast a signature that insurgents with basic equipment could detect. The SAS foot patrols, moving through the same urban terrain without vehicles and without electronic signatures, had a compromise rate that sources with direct knowledge of the task force black operational statistics have described as below 8%. 38% against 8%. On that metric alone, ignoring everything else, the British approach was producing a targeting environment 5 times more likely to find the target at home when the assault force arrived. And finding the target at home was the entire point. The assault methodology itself was the third element. When the target was home, the SAS entry teams were achieving clearance times and capture rates that the American liaison officers who observed them were still struggling to account for years after the events. The 17-second room clearance that features in multiple accounts of Task Force Black operations was not a statistical outlier. It was a reflection of a training methodology that had been producing this specific capability since the Iranian embassy in 1980, and that had been refining it through every hostage rescue, every Northern Ireland entry, every Killing House repetition in the intervening 25 years. The Killing House at the regiment's Hereford base was where the explanation lived. Not in the building itself, though the building was purpose-built for the specific function. In the accumulated hours, An SAS operator completing the close-quarter battle phase of continuation training fired an estimated 5,000 rounds in the killing house before being assessed as qualified. 5,000 rounds at the specific ranges, in the specific room dimensions, against the specific target configurations that operational entry required. By the time a qualified operator had added 3 or 4 years of operational deployments, with the additional live firing and continuation training that the regiment ran between deployments, the total round count was a number that most soldiers did not accumulate across an entire career. What that accumulation produced was not simply accuracy. Accuracy was a prerequisite, established long before the killing house phase. What the accumulated repetition produced was something that sports scientists call automaticity, the migration of a complex skill from conscious processing to procedural memory, from something you have to think about to something your hands do while your mind is already on the next problem. An SAS operator entering a room was not making conscious decisions about target identification, weapon employment, and movement. Those processes were running on procedural memory, faster than conscious thought, leaving his conscious attention available for the higher-order decisions that the operational environment was continuously demanding. Where is the next room? Is the person on the floor a combatant or a civilian? Is there a second exit? What is moving behind the door that just opened on the left? The Americans had documented this difference with the clinical precision of people who understood exactly what they were looking at. A Delta Force medical officer, attached to a joint operation, had fitted a biometric monitoring device to an SAS operator as part of a study into physiological responses during close-quarter combat. The device recorded heart rate. During an engagement in which the operator discharged his weapon at 3 targets at close range in a building entry sequence, the recorded heart rate was 78 beats per minute. Resting heart rate. His body had been conditioned by years of repetition to treat close-quarters combat as a technical exercise rather than a life-threatening emergency. His cardiovascular system had not registered the engagement as stress. The Delta Force officer who reviewed the data required the technician to check the device twice before he accepted the reading as accurate. The general at Camp Victory had seen the biometric data. He had seen the compromise rate statistics. He had seen the round count from the Dora compound operation. 37 rounds expended across 8 operators, clearing a multi-building compound against armed resistance, a figure that an American rifleman might exhaust in a 10-second firefight. He had seen the ratio. He had said what he said. He had not said it because he was generous about British capability. He was not that kind of general. He had said it because the data was sitting in front of him, and the data was what it was. And 30 years of professional training had made him constitutionally incapable of looking at data and describing it as something other than what it said. The after-action report that should have followed was drafted by a lieutenant colonel on the planning staff who had been at the briefing and who understood what the general had said and believed it needed to be on the record. The draft was reviewed by the general, who approved its factual content. It was then reviewed by a staff officer in the JSOC administrative chain, who identified the classification level at which its conclusions would need to be handled, and noted that at that level the document would require coordination with the British Ministry of Defense before it could be filed in any system accessible to American congressional oversight. The coordination with the Ministry of Defense did not happen because the Ministry of Defense's position on public or official acknowledgement of specific SAS operational statistics in Iraq was and remains one of categorical non-disclosure. The regiment does not confirm operational figures. It does not confirm casualty ratios. It does not confirm high-value capture attribution. The official position is that Special Forces operations are not discussed, and that position is not a matter of institutional preference. It is a legal framework enforced by the Official Secrets Act and by the specific security briefings that every person with knowledge of SAS operations receives and acknowledges in writing. Without the Ministry of Defense coordination that the classification process required, the after-action report could not be filed in the form the lieutenant colonel had drafted it. The general could have instructed the staff officer to file it anyway, accepting whatever diplomatic and institutional friction the uncoordinated filing would produce. He did not. The report was placed in a system at a classification level that required additional access beyond the standard clearances of the congressional oversight staff, who would ordinarily have reviewed it. It has not been released. It has not been referenced in any publicly accessible document. Its existence is known to the people who were in the briefing room at Camp Victory, to the lieutenant colonel who drafted it, to the staff officer who reviewed the classification requirement, and to whatever institutional archiving system received it. None of those people have described it in any public forum. The ratio it would have documented has been partially reconstructed from other sources. Mark Urban's Task Force Black, the most authoritative journalistic account of SAS operations in Iraq, contains figures compiled from multiple military and intelligence sources that are consistent with the general's assessment. The 1/3 attribution for Baghdad high-value captures is referenced in accounts that have been cross-checked against the operational record by journalists with the relevant access. The compromise rate statistics have been described in general terms by sources who served in the combined special operations environment, without the specific figures being formally confirmed. The biometric data from the medical study has been referenced by American operators, speaking years after the events in the careful language of people who understand what they can and cannot say. The picture that emerges from these fragments is consistent with what the general said in the briefing room. The British had more men in the sense that mattered, which was not numerical superiority, but individual capability per operator. So high that the multiplication of that capability across 60 people produced an output that hundreds of American operators with 10 times the budget were measuring themselves against and finding the comparison uncomfortable. They had more money in the sense that mattered, which was the investment in selection and training that had been compounding since 1941, us producing a type of soldier whose capability could not be replicated by a procurement decision or a budget increase. They had more equipment in the sense that mattered, which was the equipment that walked through the door on 2 legs and cleared the room in 17 seconds, and came back with the target alive and the intelligence that would identify 3 more targets by dawn. The British element paid for what they were doing in ways that the operational statistics did not capture. The sustained tempo, multiple raids per night for months, every operator going through a door multiple times per week in the most dangerous city on Earth, was grinding bodies and minds in ways that would not become fully visible until operators returned home, and the physical and psychological accumulation of what they had done began to settle. Senior non-commissioned officers who served through the peak period have described it in the understated language that the regiment's culture produces, language that carries more weight for what it does not dramatize than for what it says directly. The cumulative musculoskeletal injuries from carrying 30 to 40 kilograms of equipment on every raid, bodies working at their structural limits night after night for months. The sleep debt that accumulated in an operational schedule that did not allow for full recovery between operations. The psychological weight of the decisions made in rooms at close range, decisions that were correct and legally justified and operationally necessary, and that nevertheless had to be carried by the men who made them. The regiment's medical officer at Hereford later documented a significant increase in musculoskeletal presentations among personnel who had completed multiple Iraq rotations. Injuries to knees, ankles, and spines that in peacetime would have produced medical downgrade or discharge. The operators who carried those injuries had not disclosed them during the deployment, because disclosing them would have meant not going out the next night, and not going out the next night meant that someone else would have to go in their place, and the culture of the regiment made that an unacceptable option when you were still physically capable of doing the job, even if the medical definition of physically capable had been stretched to a point where it was no longer quite honest. 2 operators were killed during Task Force Black operations in Iraq. The specific circumstances of their deaths remain classified. Their names are on a memorial at Hereford that is not photographed and not publicized and not discussed in the language of public commemoration that other military losses receive. The regiment does not hold public memorial services. It holds the knowledge of what happened and keeps it internal in the way that it keeps everything internal, because the internal keeping is what the institution has always been and what it requires itself to continue being in order to function as it does. The general who said they still beat us was rotated out of theater 8 weeks after the briefing at Camp Victory. His subsequent career followed the trajectory of a senior officer whose record was strong and whose institutional standing was intact. He has not given interviews about the period. He has not written memoirs in the genre that senior American military figures often produce in retirement. He has not, in any public forum, repeated the words he said in the briefing room, or indicated that he said them, or described the meeting in which he said them. The lieutenant colonel who drafted the report has also not spoken publicly about it. The staff officer who reviewed the classification requirement has not spoken publicly about it. The British exchange officer who was in the room has not spoken publicly about it. The 14 members of the planning cell who were present when the words were said are distributed across the retired and still serving population of the American military, bound by the classification obligations that attach to everything that was discussed in that room and to the existence of the report that came out of it. What is left is the ratio. the ratio that was visible in the operational statistics before the briefing, and that remains visible in the fragments of the operational record that have been partially reconstructed through journalistic investigation in the years since. Less than 5% of the Special Operations Force, 1/3 of the high-value captures. The ratio does not require the report to speak. It says what the report would have said in the precise, unhedged language of a number that means exactly what it appears to mean and nothing else. No, the American military has absorbed the operational lessons of this period in the way that effective military institutions absorb operational lessons by building them into doctrine, training, and force structure without necessarily crediting the source. The compressed targeting cycle that McChrystal formalized into the Find, Fix, Finish, Exploit, Analyze framework drew explicitly on the rapid exploitation methodology that the SAS had pioneered in Northern Ireland and refined in Iraq. The shift toward lower signature foot-borne operations in dense urban environments that JSOC began implementing from 2007 onward reflected the compromise rate data that was only this visible because the British comparison was available. The individual marksmanship and room clearance standards that American Special Operations units have raised progressively since the Iraq period reflect, in part, the specific and uncomfortable comparison that the biometric data and the round count statistics made impossible to avoid. The lessons were learned. The source was not always credited, because crediting the source required producing a document that described the ratio, and the ratio was the document that was not filed. The classification that was applied to the after-action report when it became clear that filing it required coordination that was not going to happen was not a conspiracy. It was an institutional process that produced an institutional outcome. The outcome was that the most precise formal assessment of what the SAS had achieved in Baghdad, prepared by an American general who had seen the data and said out loud what the data meant, did not enter the accessible record. It is in a system somewhere, on a server or in a physical archive or in both, at a classification level that the people who were in the room that day are mostly no longer cleared to access. The general is retired. The lieutenant colonel is retired or close to it. The exchange officer is wherever exchange officers go when the exchange ends. The words that were said in the briefing room at Camp Victory are in the memory of everyone who heard them, and in no document that any of them can read. The map of Baghdad that covered one wall of the briefing room has been taken down. The room has been used for other briefings, other assessments, other moments when a general said something that the room waited for. The building itself is part of a base that has been handed over, drawn down, reduced to whatever it is now in the geography of a country that the coalition occupied and left, and whose current condition is itself a kind of document that nobody filed. Somewhere in that system, at its classification level, the report sits. The opening paragraph, the one the general would have written if the report had been filed in the form it was drafted, has never been read by anyone who was not in the room when he said the words that should have been its first sentence. He said they had more men. He said they had more money. He said they had more equipment. The map of Baghdad was on the wall behind him. The ratio was in the statistics on the table in front of him. And then He said the thing that the room had been waiting for him to say. The thing that the data had been saying for 14 months without any senior officer putting it in those terms. He said they still beat us. And then he said nothing else worth writing down, because everything worth writing down was already in that sentence, and the sentence was never filed. And the filing cabinet that holds what should have come after it is in a building that is not on any map you are permitted to read.